system to the planet, the planetary system, to, the atmospheric conditions, to the origin of life and how this gets into the biology. And it seems to all fit together in sort of a cumulative kind of approach.
Yeah, I just think there's just so much more work to do on all these things. Like,
oh yeah, absolutely.
There's heaps of this stuff that's only just been kind of touched on a little bit. So people can go in depth on all kinds of aspects of the geology and atmospheric stuff, planetary science, the moon, like lots of stuff that can be explored more, I think.
Oh, absolutely.
Agreed. Yes. So like what I'm wondering though is, and this is just a preliminary, just a basic question. Yeah, I'm stumbling over my words already. But what do you see the goal is, guys? I mean, really, what is the goal of this teleology? What is it working itself towards?
So I guess I'll go ahead and start. I have a different, so Zachary is obviously an expert in biology, common descent, things of that nature, whereas my studies are a little less prominent. I'm in the atmospheric sciences, but I see sort of kind of like I was saying, a cumulative case of the cosmological, the local fine tuning, and how this gets, and even how the local fine tuning will sort of guide the biological process. And then, that's kind of gets into his area of teleology within biology. And so it's kind of this idea of goal, direction, purpose, meaning, things like that.
Right on. Zach, what do you think?
Yeah. There's just so much to say. I'm kind of stuck. There's so many different directions you can go in, but
Right.
like for me, the specific goal doesn't matter so much, but we'll come to this later. Like the idea of the anthropic principle, like it doesn't have to be humans that are the goal, which is what some people would kind of think is what we're talking about. So I would just talk about like a life-friendly universe or something like that.
Right on. Yeah.
Yeah, but we can get into that.
Yes, definitely. Will, guys, this is backstage talk. We're just chilling out here, figuring out everything. But yes, we are about to start. So everybody mute your mics, and here we go.
Hey, what's going on? I am Travis with Proselytize or Apostatize, and I'm here with the amazing host, David Russell. So what's going on, David? Happy Saturday,
man.
bro.
Yeah, happy Saturday to you, man. What's been going on with you, buddy?
Oh, not much. Just doing a lot of reading, stuff like that.
Well, I heard you've been debating too.
Oh yeah. So I don't want to. I'm really happy with my argumentation I provided in the debate, and I will just say to the presuppositionalist, they should not have any beef with the evidentialist as long as you have what they call an epistemic device, like phenomenal conservatism, reformed epistemology. As long as you have, that, there's really no sufficient reason to, go against the evidentialist. So I was very pleased and kind of wanted to hammer that home that, hey, look, you guys don't corner the market on having epistemic devices or knowledge of God. So yeah.
Right on. Yeah, man. I think we've all been debating and speaking on other shows too. We just had a collaboration show with the Complete Sinner's Guide, and we debated alternate media on the divinity of Christ, which was really cool.
I saw that.
Yeah, that was a fun show. But yeah, man, what are we doing here today, Travis?
Okay, so we are going to be interviewing my good friend Zach, and I am going to go ahead and bring him on. Okay,
he's here.
So, all right, great to have you. So, Dr. Zachary Ardern is a postdoctoral research fellow in microbial evolutionary genetics at the Wellcome Sanger Institute in Cambridge, United Kingdom. He is originally from New Zealand, which is also the home of my good friend Samuel Watkinson. So, Zach, welcome. Great to have you. And if you want to take a minute, introduce yourself, tell us, more about what you do, what you're working on, and things of that nature.
Yeah. Thanks, heaps. It's good to be here with you guys. So I'm a biologist. My day job is computational biology, is comparing genomes, mostly of different bacteria, or some work on SARS-CoV-2 as well recently, like a lot of people in the area. My undergrad degrees were, and my PhD were both from the University of Auckland in New Zealand. In undergrad, I studied conjoint degrees. So I studied arts and science. The arts was philosophy and economics. The science was biology. And so I'm particularly interested in like philosophy of biology and its interaction with natural theology, which is what we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, really looking forward to it because you and Seth Harder are two of my Facebook friends that I really look up to, who are really emphasizing a lot of work that I think is really important in the philosophy of biology, and that's this idea of teleology. And so that's going to kind of get into the first question that I really wanted to bring up, and especially for audience clarification. I want to get into the meaning of teleology because, there's so many different things we can mean when we say teleology. Some, use it synonymous with like fine tuning. So what specifically do you mean by teleology, and especially in like biological systems? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I have a pretty broad view that teleology is just an underlying plan or purpose, and that could be worked out in various different ways. So maybe philosophers of biology will want to kind of get more precise on that. But for me, that works. And like fine tuning would be an example of teleology. But that's just one kind of like route by which you can infer teleology. But teleology itself is just the idea that there is an underlying plan or purpose to something. In this case, to evolution, particularly.
So would you say it could also be defined as sort of goal, direction, or aboutness, like even like microbial organisms, their own good, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think you cut out just briefly, but I'd see all these things as more or less along the same lines that, like intentionality, purpose, goal directedness. You can split differences between them, but the basic idea is, I think, the same. So and definitely the kind of teleology I'm thinking about is personal, in that it has like an intentional aspect. And some aspects of teleology, like maybe Thomas Nagel's approach or something, that would be a bit different. So I do have a theistic concept of teleology, particularly. Yeah.
Yeah. What really piqued your interest in this, if I might ask? In this entire topic?
Sure. I think most Christians who go into biology end up kind of having to work out something about this area, trying to work out what they think about evolution and Christian faith. And I was just interested in philosophy particularly, and thought, that this is a kind of obvious area of overlap, and I ended up kind of unexpectedly actually going specifically into evolutionary biology rather than some other area of biology. I thought maybe I might go into like structural biology or other areas of molecular biology. So then, yeah, I decided that what I really wanted to do is get into the fundamentals of evolutionary theory, and that kind of has some overlap with some philosophical stuff. So I managed to do both things.
Oh,
Wow,
definitely.
awesome.
So, one thing that I was kind of curious about, and we were kind of hinting at this when we were talking backstage, with this aspect of how the cosmic fine tuning leads into, what's known as the local fine tuning, which, for the audience, it seems like we need the precise gravitational interaction with the moon, the precise ocean depths, the degree of plate tectonics, the volcanic activity, and the environmental constraints. The atmosphere places on the biological process and everything. And so in that there's sort of this what's known as the anthropic principle, and this is a bit controversial, but I'm wondering if you think that the anthropic principle extends into biochemical systems.
Yeah, so the answer to most of the questions that you'll give me probably will be it depends.
Right.
So in this case, it'll depend on what we mean by the anthropic principle, because that's kind of everyone who's talked about that has given a slightly different, well, there's lots of different perspectives on that. So in the kind of the weakest sense of the anthropic principle is that there's some kind of observer selection effect, so that the fact you have observers means that there has to be certain prerequisites, that the environment has to have a particular conditions in order to have observers. So that's kind of like a truism, basically, that it's completely unsurprising that given that there is an observer, that then you need to have an environment that allows observers to exist. So definitely in the weak sense, of course, these observer selection effects are going to impact the kind of stuff we see in all of science, including in biochemistry and such. There's like a strong version of the anthropic principle. Like I guess maybe a really strong version is that the universe is like intending to produce humans in some sense, and I'd say that's too strong for me. I don't think humans specifically have to be part of what I perceive as the teleology of the universe. But so I would just say that I think the universe is life friendly, and that's kind of the anthropic principle. But I think also helpful is to think about the alternative, which is sometimes called like a Copernican principle.
Yes.
And that's the idea that there's nothing special about the universe, or there's nothing special about our place in the universe in a general sense. And I would definitely reject that. So I'd reject the Copernican principle. And whether I accept an anthropic principle depend on, what we mean by anthropic principle.
Yeah, I was just wondering real quick, like just as Christian guys talking and having fun and being nerds here. I am a nerd, but what do you see that as? What do you see the universe? If it's not humans, what is it? What would you think?
So theologically, it's going to be Jesus. That's always a good answer, theologically, that could be worded out in different ways. But scientifically, there's some things that like people like Michael Denton say, which is pretty interesting, that you can get some way towards maybe humans. But I don't want to make that kind of strong argument. I think it's fine if we say the universe looks like it's much more life friendly than we would expect given naturalism. For me, that's plenty, and that's a really interesting argument by itself. People could go further and say there's something special about humans, and we could explore that. But I think it's enough to make naturalists worried if the universe is life friendly. So I'm happy to go just that far.
Yeah, absolutely. And I am kind of one of those people that do argue for the stronger version of it being geared towards embodied, consciously self-aware moral agents. But I do like what you said too with regards to the weak anthropic principle, because a lot of times you'll hear this observational selection effect uses sort of a defeater to fine tuning. And it's like, well, we don't deny that. Of course, there's an observational selection effect in the weak anthropic principle, but that does nothing to explain why it should be the case. And so, yeah, so there's much I agree with you on there. But what I did want to get into is, we often hear, because we're going to kind of transition into this idea of common descent. And we often hear, common descent, can be explained through purely natural terms. So I'm wondering what sort of teleology it is that you see involved in common descent, and how, and from this we can kind of subway into your specific argument that you have. And I know that you and Rope have been working on.
Yeah. So this will take a little bit to unpack, but so to start with, so like some people will contrast, like they'll say, okay, you've got common descent, and that's if that's given by natural causes, then there's no role for teleology.
Right.
And I would say I think common descent does have natural causes, or at least there's a reasonable case for that. But that doesn't actually give the full explanation of why common descent works. So I think this is true for scientific explanations in general, that just because you've given a scientific explanation of something doesn't mean you've actually explained it fully.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
So like you can give a scientific explanation for the origin of the solar system. That still at least leaves open the possibility that God wanted the origin of the solar system. But it's kind of like a deeper question, or like a separate question. So I'm not worried if there are natural causes for things. Right. So all the arguments that I would offer in this kind of area actually say, okay, given, let's say this is all true. Let's say there's a purely natural story behind life, the history of life, then, what follows from that? And I think there's various ways in which we could still say, well, given the kinds of things we see, it actually supports teleology over naturalism. So to try and summarize that, I think you can have natural causes, but then you could still want an explanation for why those causes are the way that they are. So just because someone's given natural causes doesn't just by itself get rid of the need for teleology or design or purpose or anything like that. And I think actually there is a reasonable inference you can make regarding kind of teleology at the level of physics, level of chemistry, level of biology, in a bunch of different ways. Some more specifics I had noted down. So I would think that I would kind of argue that I've done this in depth and in various YouTube videos that people can find, that some of the foundations of evolutionary biology look like they need to be special in order for evolution to work as well as it did.
Okay.
This is like definitely an ongoing research field, and I'm just kind of giving some examples of things that look to me like they're pretty well established in the literature so far. But if people have pushback or questions, that's cool. And I'm not like holding these things really firmly. I'm just saying this is what it looks like to me, basically. So, like for instance, whatever the last universal common ancestor was, and then whatever the first cell was, maybe there was a bit of a gap between those two things. But whatever those really early life forms were, I think they needed to be special in order to produce life as we know it. So there's a lot of stuff that we have in our cells that goes back to the last universal common ancestor. And I think you can imagine lots of situations where you had a simple cell and it just went nowhere. Evolution didn't really happen.
Yeah, that's really good.
Yeah, so in order for evolution to happen the way that it did, I think you needed a pretty special kind of really early life. That's just one example. Another example, which I've done some work on, is the structure of the standard genetic code. So that's the mapping between codons, nucleotides, and amino acids. And that specific mapping, we've published a couple of papers on this, and there's more work coming out, and a bunch of other papers other people have published that suggest that mapping is pretty surprising. And it's pretty fundamental, like it's shared basically across all of life. And this specific mapping, I think, actually helps evolution to happen. And this is stuff that I'm working on currently. There's kind of a couple more technical things I just briefly mentioned. The mapping between genotype and phenotype. So that's like, what's the relationship between like genetics, DNA, and the forms that are produced in terms of like protein structures or like the shapes of cells or the morphologies of animals. Right? There's some kind of mapping that, okay, given this sequence, if you change it in this way, it will have this change at the level of the form, the morphology. And there's like you can imagine that as like a map or like a terrain or something. And that map has to be, like, if that map was random, evolution couldn't work. That's been shown very clearly in lots of studies. That's not too surprising, but I think stronger than that, I think the map has to be pretty special in order for evolution to work. In order to get to higher and higher complexity, you need to be able to, like, an evolutionary search has to be able to find new stuff that's interesting. And that requires certain kind of like parameters and things, which aren't like just, you can't just take them for granted. They're not like immediately obvious, because you can imagine lots of situations, you can simulate lots of situations where evolution just doesn't go anywhere because mutations don't produce interesting stuff fast enough and the population just dies out. And a similar kind of point is the structure of the fitness landscape also has to be right. So then natural selection can actually work. Like, you can actually move up the mountain of fitness. You can actually get to higher fitness because it's easy. There's lots of cases where that's not the case, where fitness landscapes don't allow you to evolve further. So the fact that we've been able to get from a single cell to the human brain in a couple of billion years, that was that it seems like a long time, but actually it's not that much time given the kind of complexity that's evolved. So I think that map looks pretty special. I'd say it looks like maybe it's fine-tuned or purposeful. Yeah.
Right. And what's always struck me is how, early life got here, because it seems almost in a geological instant, like as soon as it was almost available, it was here, because I think we pushed it to anywhere from 4.1 to 3.8 billion years, with the Earth being like, what, 4.56 billion years old? I mean, so we have like life here really early, which to me seems quite miraculous. Even if kind of like even if there is a naturalistic explanation behind it, that itself to me seems pretty powerful.
Yeah, I think that's like debated how, like, because maybe you can even push it back further, but then you have the late heavy bombardment and
Right.
and
Yeah.
whether that's whether it's going to destroy life and things, that's like an open question. But yeah, whichever route you take, life appeared pretty quickly, and
Right.
then whatever that life was, I would go further. That, like, okay, the fact that it even evolved further beyond that is not just something we can kind of take for granted necessarily. So we can ask the question, if early life was different, would we really expect to see the kind of complexity that we see? Yeah.
So where do you land on the whole sort of like structuralism versus functionalism debate in biology?
Yeah. So just for the audience, I guess that's like a massive debate.
Yeah, so I didn't mean to open a can of worms there, but
yeah, that's been going on for centuries, and it's kind of asking, like, is it what's driving the things that we see in biology? What's like the main cause for what we see? Is it driven by functional adaptations, or is it driven by like underlying structure or form? And this debate was ongoing before evolution. Like, there were people who didn't believe in evolution, like William Paley would basically a functionalist, and saying that the reason stuff is the way it is because God wanted precisely adapted organisms that were adapted to their environment, basically. But then there are others, like structuralists like Richard Owen, that would say actually it's the underlying kind of Platonic plan, which is, and it's not about the specific functions of the organs or the organisms. It's about the consistent kind of law-like plan that's realized in different forms. That's just to explain the situation. My answer is I don't know. I think they're both true to some extent, but I'm leaning in evolution biology in general. I think it's starting to lean back towards the structuralist direction a bit more, because some people, like, I guess Richard Dawkins is kind of the classic case, and some others in kind of classical, like, modern evolutionary theory would be very functionalist and say selection that's doing everything. But recently, with extended evolutionary synthesis and things like this, there's a bunch of ways in which actually underlying structure is explaining a lot of what we see in biology.
Right. And so we're going to get to kind of like some objections you would run into and how you would answer those. But first, the reason I brought that up is because I find this, the history of evolution so fascinating. I was wanting to kind of, and you had mentioned them, what your thoughts are on Richard Owen's earlier formulation and how it kind of relates to common descent, that these are kind of like common archetypes. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so there's different ways that people could run this. Like they could say this is an alternative to common descent. This is what like some intelligent design people would say, oh no, it just looks like common descent because actually there's a common underlying plan. So,
Sure,
so
yeah.
I would reject that. I guess obvious to most people here because I think there's good evidence for common descent, which kind of gets around that, like with specific molecular details. That the patterns of molecular similarities like fit the nested hierarchy which common descent predicts, and there's no kind of clear, straightforward, intelligent design hypothesis that also predicts these as well. That's roughly my main reason for thinking common descent is true. There's also the historical, like the fact it also matches the fossil record and such pretty well. But that's yeah, so that's saying I don't accept it as an alternative to common descent, but if instead we have like a general structuralist picture where
That's what I was
evolution, is kind of working according to underlying structure, then I'd be sympathetic to that. But I think like there's way more work to do there to spell out what does it actually mean, especially in my field, molecular evolution. What does it like I'm sympathetic to structuralism, but what does that actually mean for my day-to-day job? What does that predict in terms of what DNA sequences should look like? Stuff like that. Right. That's not so clear. Yeah.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, David, did you have any questions before I run on to my next question?
No, go ahead, buddy. This is fascinating.
Okay, so I'm wondering, and we had talked about this backstage. Do you think this would play a role in sort of a larger cumulative fine-tuning case? Because I know from what you were describing, it sounds a lot like there's a lot of fine-tuning that may be going on in these chemical processes. And I'm wondering if you would be like, would you extend that to sort of a larger cumulative kind of fine-tuning argument?
Yeah, so the kind of thing that I'm mostly thinking about in this area is like fine-tuning of the fundamentals of evolutionary biology.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, so things like fitness landscapes, I think, are a really good example. And definitely, it's entirely possible. I'm very sympathetic to the idea that it also kind of fits within a system which is fine-tuned in other aspects. So I think there's really good evidence, of course, that like cosmology, some of the fundamental parameters of cosmology need to be fine-tuned in order to produce a life-permitting universe. And I think the same is true for some of these other things, like some of the fundamentals of chemistry, things that Michael Denton has shown. And because each of these are independent, as far as the specific arguments I'm interested in are concerned, it doesn't matter if someone shows that, oh, Michael Denton was wrong about some of that stuff. Right. I'm definitely sympathetic to it, but so they're related, but also I just want to stress that they're also independent. So someone doesn't like some of those other specific arguments, that by itself doesn't give them reason to reject the kind of thing that I'm saying. So each of these arguments needs to be looked at on its own. But
yeah, so that's a good point. That you have these like different, like let's say, stages of maybe fine tuning, like the cosmic, the solar system, the local, the planetary conditions, and then your aspect of teleology and biology. And you're sort of saying, well, hey, look, even if one of those fails, that does nothing to touch my area and where the research is at on my end.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and also like, in some sense, these are temporal, like because life came later. But in some sense, also they're not temporal, like because the structure, like the underlying genotype phenotype map, I would say that's a basic of like biophysics or something. Sure. So even if life never existed, this underlying structure would still, like, it's just like a potential mapping would still exist. It's
Right.
like a conditional mapping, like given that you have this kind of biological entity and these kinds of, if you did mutate it, then these would be the results in terms of the phenotypes. So people like Andreas Wagner, a very famous and important evolutionary biologist, he sees these as like Platonic forms.
Right.
You don't need to be a Platonist. There's more like an analogy, really, but there's something like that, and that just shows that they're not something that cropped up late in the history of the universe, but they're foundational to science. So that, I think, this just helps to clarify that what I'm saying is not like an interventionist picture where like God later had to input stuff. That's a separate question, which I'm also open to. That's a separate issue. These are all like fundamental kind of scientific parameters, if I'm right about it. Yeah.
Right. And one thing I really like about your approach, which I adopt myself, is, it's not that God is intervening in the process because evolution just somehow couldn't cut it, and that, God is, needing to come in and intervene and tweak this and tweak that. It would be like an underlying explanation of why we have the process and why we have it in such a way that we do. So
Yeah,
I really,
sure.
I really like that approach. And David, if you didn't have any questions or clarifications, I'm going to go ahead and transition to some objections.
Yeah, absolutely. Go ahead, buddy. I mean, yeah, this is fascinating. I think everything's been explained pretty clearly.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, unless people just don't understand some of these baseline terms, but other than that, I think it's going great.
Well, that's what Google's for.
Right. We ain't doing all your homework, folks.
So I guess one immediate question is, because I want to get into the philosophical, but first, and I had asked Seth this with regards to his research also, what's some major pushback you would get from the scientific community who may not be on board? Like, let's say you have like a strict Richard Dawkins, functionalist type thing that says that, it's purely natural, no teleology needed. Do you get like a lot of pushback scientifically? And if so, how would you deal with the objections?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. So I'm just starting to kind of explore these things and put it out there, and I'm waiting to hear some really killer responses that are going to knock it down. But I mean, so far I haven't, and maybe it's just I haven't spoken to enough people about it, or maybe I'm just ignored the responses because of cognitive bias.
I doubt that, yeah.
Which is possible, but yeah, so far, and this is true for a lot of things, but so far the responses are not really scientific that I can think of. There's a lot more work to do. Maybe that's partly because the way I phrase it is usually I try and be real careful and say that there's a lot more work to do in this. And I'm not saying this is. So I think it's like similar to the fine tuning case, but the global cosmological fine tuning is way more like quantitative. Like you've got numbers you can pin down for it.
Sure.
So that's nice and that's good, and that has a lot of advantages. And this area doesn't have that. So maybe that's one reason why it's harder to give like scientific pushback, just because I've been a bit fuzzy in how I'm spelling it out. But so there's that. But then with some of the things like the genetic code optimality and things, we're starting to put numbers on that and starting to explore that more. Some of these things are maybe going to be impossible to put really good numbers on, but I think we can get a sense that this looks improbable, and that's enough for me. I'm not too worried about being super quantitative. It's more like just to recognize that this stuff is surprising. Some of this stuff looks really surprising given the assumptions that naturalists did have. So when naturalists come across it and they realize the philosophical implications, then they should shift their views somewhat, shift their credences a bit. That's all I want people to do.
Right. And one way, I would see this like let's say from a scientific point of view is, of course, you have to have all this precision, for because the early universe, we have things like hydrogen, helium, maybe tiny traces of lithium, beryllium, and boron, and then these heavier elements start building up in the furnace of stars. You have the cosmic expansion forming rocky planets and everything. But when you get to Earth, you do have, like you were saying, this quantitative sort of like local fine tuning, we can measure as far as the oxygenation events, the degree of plate tectonics, the atmospheric condition, the history of life on the planet's surface, and all these things. And I think it's interesting that we have these things that you really can put numbers on, with like what I'll refer to as the local fine tuning, and then how you have this field that you're getting into, and it looks like it continues. So it just seems like from the top down, it just you really get this overwhelming impression of design, or at least at the very minimum precision that goes into life.
Yeah, I think precision is a really helpful term.
Yeah.
And yeah, so most of the responses will be philosophical, and even often the people, if they're scientists or if they're making these responses, they won't realize that actually they're giving a philosophical response. But
Sure.
so things like the problem of evil will be a problem for any design argument, or different aspects of that, like apparent bad design or apparent malicious design, probably the two main categories. And I fully accept that these are like legitimate responses and powerful responses. Right. I'm not too worried about it, because this will be a response to any theistic kind of thing. So I don't feel a special burden to deal with that. I think philosophers have given reasonable responses to some of these things. And another way that I think about it is that I'd actually be really happy if an atheist says, oh yeah, these design arguments look quite powerful, but what about the problem of evil? And then I'd say, okay, that's fine. Well, how about we trade them? How about we kind of say they equal out? I'd be really happy with that, because the atheist doesn't have much else apart from the problem of evil in its various forms. Right. So if I have to sacrifice design arguments in exchange for the problem of evil, that would be actually a win for the theist, I'd say, because there's a bunch of other theistic arguments that I think are powerful.
Right. So I would kind of like to get into some of these philosophical issues. And I think it's really interesting that it's kind of, I think the reverse can be said as well, because on things like natural evil, under the hypothesis of indifference, I do find it quite surprising that these processes would be fine-tuned to produce life if they're totally indifferent. Like, predator to prey relationships are necessary for functioning ecosystems. The disasters of like hurricanes regulate precipitation. And so that's sort of something I wouldn't expect, giving something like total indifference. But one thing I did want to bring up, and this will kind of get into your field, and this is, in my view, a pretty powerful and common objection the atheist will argue, is this idea of animal pain, and that evolution in that sense would seem to favor indifference, because you have, like, let's say hundreds of millions of years of animal pain and suffering. The example that's often used is like fawns needlessly dying in forest fires and things of that nature. So how would you kind of respond to the problem of animal pain?
Yeah, so that's the kind of thing I was thinking about when I said the problem of evil. I guess there's different aspects of that. And so this is the kind of stuff that I don't have detailed responses to. I mean, part of the response is that in order to have these things, you need to have complex life forms, right, with a particular cognitive system. And that's, if the things I say are true, then that's improbable given naturalism. So that seems to undercut the argument kind of a bit. Or at least, even if it doesn't undercut the specific argument, in the wider context, it kind of does, if that makes sense. Because if you need something that's really unlikely given naturalism in order to make a particular naturalistic argument, then that's not so good for the naturalist, basically. And that's the situation I think that, given this situation where we have life, the fact that there's a lot of pain and death and suffering, that's could be seen as evidence against theism. But the fact we even have life at all is actually evidence for theism, so that kind of pushes back on it a bit. That'd be my main response. There are other things I'm interested in. I think it's Michael Murray, I may have got that name wrong, has a response to that, which is not very popular, but I'm personally sympathetic to. But I haven't really investigated it that much. I just see my niche is more investigating these kind of fine-tuning things. And I'm happy
Right.
to leave the problem of pain stuff to philosophers.
Yeah, let the philosophers duke it out. I hear you. One thing that of course, as being part of Reasons to Believe, I'm obviously going to plug Hugh Ross. He has a book called Why the Universe Is the Way It Is, which I'm really sympathetic to, and also Improbable Planet. They kind of go together, and he will mention, similar to you, that the problems of animal pain and suffering and everything. Well, you'll notice that it's in these situations are fine tuned, like I was mentioning, predator to prey relationships. Like the carnivores usually go after the sick and dying, and they actually help the herbivores survive and thrive, and then likewise they help the carnivores survive and thrive. And so you have this intricate balance for functioning ecosystems. And then a lot of these natural disasters, number one, could be avoided with our knowledge of them, and number two, they're what's necessary for life to exist in the first place. And I don't think that's quite sufficient on its own to handle the problem of like natural pain, evils, and everything. But in addition to all this fine tuning, the laws of physics, he'll argue, are geared towards the ultimate eradication of evil. So it's like God is authorized, number one, to finely tune the system, to bring about embodied moral agents and everything, and that he's, moral and permitting it so far as it's going to be overcome. So the laws of physics are designed that evil will eventually be overcame, and through the atonement of Christ and everything.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think Christians have stuff to say that often they don't say in response to the problem of evil. That I think a specifically Christian response is going to be more powerful in some ways than just a theistic response, because theism doesn't really give you the resources for hope for the future that Jesus does. Yeah,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
on some of the stuff that, like a lot of these fine-tuning arguments and things, I wouldn't go as far as people like Hugh Ross do, just because they have like a really specific. They think that things are really specifically fine-tuned towards particular ends. That I would just be. I don't want to make as strong claims as that. Like I said, I think I said before that I think the universe is life-friendly, and that by itself is enough. And like evolution friendly as well, and that by itself is enough to challenge naturalists. And part of the reason I say this is because if you end up picking a really specific target, then you have to justify that, and you have to say, well, why not these other potential things? And actually, I think one of the biggest thing I want to say, I think, to the last question is, I think the most powerful response philosophically is to say, okay, look, it looks fine-tuned for this particular target, but then God could have had all these other targets. Why didn't he pick, like, which he could have picked? So the fact it looks fine-tuned for this specific target that God might have wanted doesn't really matter, given that, as far as we know, God could have also wanted all kinds of things. So in other words, whatever would have happened, we might have said, oh, it was fine-tuned. So responding to that kind of thing, I think, is more difficult. And that's where the cosmological fine-tuning has an advantage, because it's pretty broad. Like, it's just talking about like whether atoms kind of can combine into molecules, that kind of thing. And it's hard to imagine life without some of these basics. And that's why I'm cautious about going really specific about the target. What is the universe fine-tuned for? That kind of thing.
Right. So yeah, I can appreciate that in so much as it's a more modest claim, and so modesty, it's kind of like simplicity. Well, the more simple and modest a claim, the less ways it can be wrong than a more, than a stronger claim that's open to multiple lines of attack. So I appreciate that. Although I do kind of side with Hugh Ross, and I think where Hugh Ross lays out scientifically, I think Richard Swinburne puts very eloquently philosophically, and that's this idea of the goal or the end product of is embodied moral agents. So it's sort of this idea of moral agents like ourselves.
Yeah, and actually, that's like I should have said before, I'm actually very open to that, because that gives you the moral dimension for why God would want it. So it would kind of has a closer link to God's desires. I'm actually, when I say life friendly, I think I want to be a bit stronger than that, but I don't want to be so specific as to say
Sure.
it had to be humans as as we know them in their current form and that kind of thing, and give at a particular time on planet Earth per se.
Right.
So that's also why I'm cautious about some of the like really detailed local fine tuning stuff. Is that, well, it could have been a different planet, or it could have been a different galaxy, different solar system. That's why I want to make more modest, kind of broad, general claims, because they're easier to defend. And
sure,
yeah.
Because I have heard some design proponents. I'm not sure if Hugh Ross does, but I know some do, and I'm not sure I'm even comfortable to this extent that they'll say something like, "We're at the unique time in history where we can observe the expanded. It's only at this time in cosmic history that we would have learned about the universe," and things like that are pretty strong claims, because how do you determine like fortunate versus intent? So yeah,
I think even what's his name, Lawrence Krauss holds that view though.
Well, I mean, it's true. It's actually true. We are at the unique time where we can observe like the history of the cosmos through the observations and the expansion. But it's like, how would you argue for that being intentful versus fortunate? Is where
no, I hear you. I hear you. Yeah, I mean, it gets you to go down a rabbit hole for sure.
Yeah. A lot of these things, I just say, like, they're worth pointing out and saying this is really interesting. It seems to fit with like some kind of purpose picture, but I wouldn't want to say this is. Some people are just too strong. They're saying this is proof, or this is like really strong evidence. I just say, well, yeah, it's interesting, and then when you stack it together, that's when it becomes strong.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would have to say so.
I really like that approach, Zach. That we kind of have maybe take a more modest view and say, well, hey, look, isn't this phenomena really interesting? And it just so happens that we have this and this that leads into this, and it looks pretty theistic friendly to me. So yeah, I like that approach.
Yeah. So my aim in all of this is to say, well, actually, this Copernican principle, which people kind of take for granted, that there's really not that much evidence for, and actually, there's a ton of evidence against it.
Can you lay that out for the audience? With basically what the Copernican principle is, or what it entails?
Yeah. So Copernican principle. This is kind of putting me on the spot, but the Copernican principle, like originally,
it's basically that we're not at a unique time in cosmic history. That it's
Yeah, because it comes from Copernicus, who had a model for suggesting that instead of the Earth being at the center and having a special place, this is it's kind of a parody account, but it's kind of the thing that people say without really knowing the history. But so the way it's portrayed is that Copernicus, people before Copernicus thought the Earth had a special place because it was at the center, and he showed that it's not. And then the Copernican principle is kind of extending that into a general, or it sometimes is extended into a general claim that that the Earth is not special, and that we're not special, and that we don't have a special place, and that the universe is, I guess, like you said before, indifferent to us.
Right.
So it's kind of another way of stating like the indifference principle, or that the universe doesn't care about us, or there's nothing special about us, or even life, or the universe as it is, and it could have been different, and that's just the way it is, and that there's no evidence against this. So like Richard Dawkins says, the universe something like has precisely the properties that we would expect, given indifference. And I would just want to push back against that. It's a super strong claim, so it's actually pretty easy to push back against. But you need to believe it if you're a naturalist, or if it would be hard to reject that and still be a naturalist. You'd be quite a strange kind of naturalist. And if someone's a strange kind of naturalist, that's cool. That's fine. That's because I would say that's a step towards theism. Which
there you go. I like that.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let me get this. So one thing I'm wondering, as because I'm on reasons to believe, and I'm sympathetic to evolutionary creationism, but also hold aspects of old Earth creationism. So I'm kind of what's really important to myself is like sort of building a bridge between the evolutionary creationists and the old Earth creationist camps. What are some ways you think we could go about that? And do you think your form of teleology, in principle, could go about establishing a bridge between the two sides?
Yeah, potentially. So the whole science and religion field has a lot of different positions across it, and a lot of people are trying to set themselves up as kind of the perfect middle position that, like, pretty much everyone in the science religion field will say there's these crazy extremes on the left and there's crazy extremes to the right, but what you should really do is take my middle position. Like, there's these crazy fundamentalist young earth creationists and there's these crazy atheists, but the proper middle position is theistic evolution. Or someone will say exactly the same thing, but they'll say the proper middle position is intelligent design, or the proper middle position is the genealogical Adam and Eve. Or I could keep going with all these different. I'm going to do the same thing, and because everyone in this position kind of says the same thing, and I think I do think that this I would say evolution by design is kind of the catchphrase. This evolution by design position that I'm sympathetic towards, I think, is a middle position, and that's genuinely a middle position, in that it really does accept design, teleology, purpose, which theistic evolution struggles with. Sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly, but it's really hard to find a real place for design or teleology within theistic evolution. It becomes like a fideism that you just kind of, the design stuff is just there by faith, and it's not really something you have evidence for. So it's stronger than the theistic evolutionists often are, but it's also doesn't go against mainstream science in the way that basically intelligent design does. And intelligent design people will get upset at me for saying that, so I'd be happy to take pushback on that. But basically, basically where the intelligent design has been defined is pretty explicitly as a rejection of mainstream evolutionary theory. So in that sense, intelligent design is going against the mainstream inherently. And I think that's not necessary in order to uphold the strong design principle of teleology.
Right. So, as in, my old Earth creationist side kicking in, I see things as sort of like in a structuralist view of evolution, and that God, seeing inherent value in life, de novo creates things like the origin of life, eukaryotic cells, the body structures, plans. And so, I kind of take a hybrid view myself, where I do sort of take an old Earth creationist view, but I find myself disagreeing with you very little, and I think I'm
Well,
very
that's because he says he's
sympathetic
fuzzy
to.
on it. I'm just joking.
Yeah,
It could be. Yeah, I'm intentionally ambiguous on the controversial point, but so I'm open to this. I guess what I would push back on is it's not really so clear what like intervention needs to look like. Like, even if we think God intervenes in evolutionary history,
right,
does that mean that we're going to be able to show that scientifically? And this is where I guess I'm taking a theistic evolution line that TE people say the same thing. Is that just because God's involved with something doesn't mean that we're going to see that we're going to have some like information theory equation on the blackboard that we can write down and prove that God had to intervene at this point, which is kind of what intelligent design is trying to do. And it's like, I just haven't seen that done in a way that I think is good scientifically. And I'm not too worried about seeing that in order to think. So for me, so long as, for me, it's a real pointer towards theism, so long as we have teleology and intervention is kind of like an open question. And even if we don't have scientific evidence for specific interventions, that doesn't really worry me, because God is involved in the whole process. He's sustaining the laws of nature. He set up the whole thing. And sure, he could be also intervening. But before I want to say that as something which is empirically shown, it actually needs to be empirically shown. And so far that isn't done as well as I'd want it to be. And I think it doesn't really matter. Like, I think it's something that kind of Christians can be relaxed about whether, exactly how God was involved in the evolutionary process. That's like a really minor debate compared to the important one, which is, was God involved in the evolutionary process?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a really good point. And the way I would kind of approach it myself, it would be more along the lines of abduction when we look at like certain evidence, data, sort of an inference to the best explanation of like, perhaps. And, this isn't unique to old Earth creationism. A lot of evolutionary creationists will hold like, an interventionist view, and it's more, I want to say, theological, because one thing I do want to stress is that as half old Earth creationists and for the intelligent design proponents, I think it's really bad argumentation to sort of just like try and find holes in evolution to poke holes in. That doesn't, that's not really how you want to go about arguing your case, because I feel like they want to say, well, evolution is just insufficient, and so God has to step in and take over where evolution couldn't. And that's no, we want to posit God, behind the process, not tinkering with it.
Well, yeah, you're dealing with presuppositions at that point anyway. So,
Yeah,
I mean, that's just all there is to it.
absolutely. But
yeah, I think there's like an underlying question, like, could God work through an evolutionary process? And so long as the answer is yes, then that removes a lot of the kind of like worry that people have, because
you're fine.
The way that some people present it is that, okay, well, we know that God couldn't work through an evolutionary process because by definition evolution is an unguided process, and that kind of thing. That's where I have the problem. I think that hasn't been shown very well at all, and that's actually a philosophical debate. It's not actually dealing with the science. But people kind of assumed an answer to that question. So, okay, given that, it couldn't be an evolutionary process, because then that would be unguided and God wouldn't be involved. Therefore, we need to show that evolution doesn't suffice as an explanation. Otherwise, we'll kick God out. I just disagree with that whole kind of approach.
Right. And that's where I really appreciate your work. And I think it also, taking that kind of approach, like I was saying, helps to kind of cross the bridge between, because old Earth creationists, they will kind of distinguish themselves from intelligent design, and they'll have like they'll look at the same evolutionary thing and just offer an explanation behind it, whereas intelligent design kind of like tries to poke these holes in evolutionary theory, which I think is not just unfruitful, but it's unnecessary. It's kind of like you were saying, if God's able to be involved in the process, hey, what's the problem, But that aside, okay, so when I interviewed Seth Hart, I know you posed a challenging question to him, and so he wanted to pose a challenging question to you. Not really challenging, but he did want me to ask this. Okay, and so this is from Seth Hart, and he asks, how do you see the Aristotelian Thomas teleological argument fitting with arguments like yours and Rope's? Complementary, or the intention, or how would you kind of see those interacting?
Yeah, unfortunately, this is an area that I really need to look into more, and haven't kind of worked out, because I just don't know enough about the Aristotelian kind of metaphysics.
Sure.
From what I've seen of it, it seems like, at least the kind of naturalists that I deal with and kind of think about would have a problem with it. So, so I don't think it fits well with a really consistent naturalism. I mean, there's some Aristotelians who are strong naturalists and that disagree with that, of course. And I don't know enough about it to really respond in depth. My sense is that Aristotelianism doesn't fit well with naturalism, but it's a different kind of metaphysics to the whole of science in general, a different understanding of how we conceive of science and causality and stuff I don't know enough about. So in that sense, I see it as like complementary, or like alongside, and maybe they could be held together. I just need to rethink my metaphysics if I became an Aristotelian. And I think you could still give the different fine-tuning arguments and things, maybe, or at least you'd have I think you could still give them. But if not, then you just have this kind of a separate argument, which is also counter-naturalism, just in a different way. But I guess part of my reason for this kind of thing is I prefer to work with as much of what people have as possible. Like, I don't want to have to undermine their metaphysics if I don't need to, because then we're just going to have having a debate about metaphysics, rather than what I see as maybe some of the more interesting things that they'd be more sympathetic to. So part of it is just that pragmatically, like, I'm always an incrementalist in all kinds of debates, and like I always want to. And I think that's the way that like Paul works and his missionary stuff. And I think it's just a good Christian approach, is to go with people as far as you can down the road, and then you say, okay, a kilometer in that direction, we're going to have to diverge because we do actually disagree. But I can go with you this far, and actually by going with you, I can actually give you a better account of these things. So I think like kind of standard naturalistic approaches to science assume a bunch of stuff that Christians can give a better account of. Like laws of nature and stuff.
I agree. So it kind of sounds like there's a scientifically there's a commonality, but it seems like it's more a matter of metaphysics, and a metaphysic that you're not particularly on board with, or something along those lines.
Yeah, and I would be happy to say that I'm not on board with it, and I don't feel a need to be on board with it because the mainstream scientific community is also not on board with it. Now, they might be wrong. The Aristotelian will say, well, they're just philosophically naive. And that might be true, but for the apologetic endeavor, I don't really mind. And I don't see a difference in the way it affects my science so far. So it seems like it's not really a debate that is necessarily that relevant to me. And I'm pretty sure I can show the teleology without it. So for me, it's kind of redundant, but that'll upset the Aristotelians.
I think from what I've heard, it's kind of complimentary, if you ask me, from what I've heard of you. But that's just me.
Yeah, it could be complimentary in the sense that like it's a separate thing, which gives us the same answer.
Absolutely. Yeah,
but it's not like needed in order to develop this teleology thing, which is what some Aristotelians will say. Only in order to have teleology, you need to have this kind of metaphysics. And I don't think that's true.
Yeah. One difference I've noticed too is your definition of teleology is a lot more fit with what a lot of people would commonly refer to as fine tuning. Whereas I know they would make a big distinction between the two.
Yeah, I wish I understood it better, actually. But
you and me both. Okay. So we did have a question, and basically they were wanting to know, like, what's the summary of the argument? Pretend I didn't go to college, I joined the army instead. Is there like a really like simplified version you could use just like for your argument of teleology and common descent or biological systems as a whole? I don't know what they're really.
Yeah. So
I guess just like break it down like real simply, real quick or something.
Yeah, for sure. So the kind of argument that I want to present is an argument that evolution works because of the fundamental structure of evolutionary biology. And if that structure was different, it seems like we couldn't have evolution as we know it. So it looks like in a few of these different ways that I mentioned, like genetic code, the origin of life, the structure of the way that natural selection works, which is called the fitness landscape, all these things, they need to have a particular structure in order for evolution to work. If they had a slightly different structure, it seems in some cases that evolution wouldn't work as well as it does. And therefore, that fits better with the structure being a product of intentionality or purpose, rather than indifference or lack of purpose, which is the naturalistic option. So, the fact that evolution works so well, in other words, seems to fit better with a kind of teleology, design, purpose, goal-oriented picture of the world than an indifferent, mindless, naturalistic picture of the world.
Right. And on behalf, one thing that I want to endorse your argument too, because Whereas someone like myself and Hugh Ross would make these stronger fine-tuning claims of all this data. Yours does have the advantage of modesty. I think it's a fairly modest claim that, like, hey, you need this, to even get off the ground and get going and to function in the way it does. So it does have the advantage of modesty. It's a very modest claim, and so it obviously has less ways that it can be wrong than the stronger claims that someone like myself, Hugh Ross, and others would make. So I think you have a really an advantage, like, with the theoretical virtues. I think it's a good argument. I got to say, I'm really impressed. And he did want to follow up. Let's see what he says here. Okay, I think I got it. My explanation would be that the stars are on a repeating cycle while people are only here once. So evolutionary achievement depends upon surviving to pass knowledge obtained.
I mean, I think what that might be getting at is a pretty common objection to something, to kind of fine-tuning arguments in general, which is that, well, evolution deals with it. Like, okay, things look like they're fine-tuned, but evolution, we just evolved to survive in this particular environment that we have. And this is where my argument comes in, is that in order for you to get any evolution of the kind of thing that we're interested in, evolution of greater complexity or anything like that, it looks like you need certain kind of fundamental parameters, and you need to explain why they are the way that they are. You can't just assume evolution if you're a naturalist or an atheist. You've got to give some account for why evolution works. And pretty much everyone, every philosopher and stuff who talks about this just assumes that if you have atheism and naturalism, then you get evolution for free, and then you can explain life for free. Right. So that undermines the design argument. But my response is, well, wait a minute.
Not so fast.
Why do we have evolution that actually works to produce? And the more you dig into that at the science side, the more you see, well, actually, evolution didn't have to be the way that it is. And I mean, this is controversial among scientists, but I would say that the fact that it is the way that it is pretty surprising. And that doesn't fit so well with the assumptions that a lot of people had.
I agree. David, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Nah, man, I think, everything I've said already, that's it, man. Everything else has been greatly explained. I like a lot of it. It's interesting. It's, piques my curiosity, so.
Absolutely. And so we're past our mark. So I want to thank Zach for coming on. He's not only a friend and a scientific peer who I highly respect, but he's a fellow theist, and he's done some incredible work in the field of evolutionary biology and showing teleology within the evolutionary process. So, Zach, is there anything you want to leave us with before we head out?
Yeah, just if people want to check out more, there's a couple of long interviews on capturing Christianity that I did with my friend Creationists and Cameron Bertuzzi. And so way more details there. And a couple of essays on capturing Christianity as well, and some other things online. Okay. But, so if people want to check out more, they can do that. They can find my email address and send me emails if they have questions. I might respond. Who knows?
Okay, well, you'll want to be sure and do that. So check him out on Capturing Christianity. And in fact, I'm gonna go look up some of those articles myself, because this is Seth really got me into teleology because I had just previously been into the fine tuning, so hearing these arguments has really piqued my interest in teleology, and I think it's really worth looking into. And I'd like to encourage everyone else out there to do the same. Even if you don't agree with some of his conclusions, hey, look into it for yourself. And so with that, I think we're going to go ahead and sign out until next time.
Well, yeah. And guys, if you like these type of conversations and interviews, like Travis said, we need to, get the word out there more, and like and subscribe. So.